Atlas Fallen is the definition of an open world game. To some, that might pique your interest, to others you might find that quite boring. And while it does have some unique elements that kept me entertained for about 10 hours, ultimately I don't think the game does enough to keep you coming back. So let's talk about it. Now there are two things that had me interested in Atlas Fallen when I saw it in all the pre-release trailers and different state of plays or wherever it was announced, was that one, it looked like traversal was quite important in the game. You kind of like zip around the sand and it has some really fluid animations. That's one of the best parts about the game. And then also it's fully co-op, and unfortunately I'm a complete reviewer loner. I don't have any other reviewers to play the game with, so I didn't get to test out the co-op. But as most games go, this will be more fun with a friend. That's just like a blanket statement for pretty much every single game out there. So when it comes to these open world games, there are two things that I'm always on the lookout for as to whether this is a good open world game. This game is a typical checklist open world game, but I always ask myself two things. How is the combat, and then how is traversal? Is it fun exploring the world? And then are the objectives in the world actually varied and fun to do? Because at the end of the day, there are times when I'm in the mood for an open world game, and I'll sit down, I'll put in a podcast, and I'll just run around, do meaningless tasks, and I have fun. And Atlas Fallen has a fun combat system and a fun traversal system, but I don't think the traversal is used as much as I would like. When it comes to traversal, there are two things that stand out. So first, there's the sand traversal, which is, as you've seen in the trailers, where you're like skating along the sand. And this does feel good. One thing I will have to say is that I really like that the areas, the kind of open world or open zone areas, feel expansive and they're very vertical, which I really like, but they're not overly large. This isn't an overly large, bloated open world game. I beat this game in 10 hours, and if I wanted to 100%, it would maybe take 20, just maybe above 20. But I like how contained this game is. It's not, AC Valhalla that has this big sprawling map. But back to the traversal. So you have the sand slide and the dash, and they're your main ways of getting around. And it's just fun and fluid. It's similar again to Forspoken, where actually just traversing the world is actually probably one of the better parts of the game. The only problem is, and I really wish they did something like the Pathless, is when you're sliding around, there's no real way to like increase your speed, or there's no boosts or anything to do. Eventually you unlock a perk that gives you a small speed boost if you go over like a flower to collect or like a resource. But the world isn't set up like that. In a game like the Pathless, obviously everything was set up around sliding and shooting the targets to get your speed boost up. But with Atlas Fallen, the world isn't built like that. And I would have loved if there was something almost to kind of give me a little, I don't know, mini game or something to kind of focus on as I was running around the world and like exploring. Because as I said, the levels are small enough, so you're never really like, just sliding for 5 or 10 minutes straight. There's always something to do in between. And even if you want to get from one point of the map to the next, to slide across it only takes a minute or two. But I think having something to kind of add a game to it where you're trying to go through a checkpoint or you're trying to pick something up to get a speed boost would have been a nice addition. And as I said, the verticality of the world is probably my favorite part, because in the open world, there's a couple of objectives. There's like little hidden treasures to find. There's chests to find. But then there are these shared puzzles. Well, they're not really puzzles. They're more time trials. So you go up to something, you raise it out of the ground, and then it shows like an objective to where you need to go to. And at the start, these are pretty easy, where it's just, oh, I'm at the top of a hill. There's another shard down the bottom. I just need to get down. You might have to do 2 or 3 of them, and then you get a chest or something at the end of it. But later on in the later levels, and I'm not going to show the third area. I'm just going to leave that like spoiler free. I'm only going to show the first 2 areas. They kind of get a bit more challenging, where you have to use the verticality of the map, or you kind of have to pre-plan your route to raise platforms out of the ground. And they were my favorite part of the open world objectives, because as I said, traversal is just fun, it's fluid. It has almost I wouldn't exactly say a zen-like feeling, but there is definitely something calming and just chill to just sliding along the sand, and it feels really good. Now, unfortunately, the rest of the open world objectives, I mean, to be honest, I'm struggling to think of more open world objectives apart from sand sliding puzzles. Later on, you get ones that like raise platforms, that add like platforming challenges, but from the ones that I've done, they're not very difficult, and they're very few and far between. And then on top of that, there's other things like these Telos shrines that you have to destroy, and they're just like 4 different weak points that you have to break. They're pretty easy. And then sort of the watchtowers of the game, which you go to an area and it's kind of like shrouded in sand and dust and fog and you can't really see. And then you have to fight hard enemies to break the tower, and then you unlock the area essentially. And then there's also anvils, which are how you upgrade things, and then also how you fast travel. And they're just like something that you find. It's not like too crazy. And I think it's probably time that you touch on the Gauntlet. So the Gauntlet adds the dash, which is very useful. Probably the most useful thing in the whole game. But also the whole thing, and I remember seeing this in the pre-release stuff, was raising stuff out of the sand. Like you raise platforms. And this just isn't used as good or as well, or it's hardly even used full stop to any potential whatsoever. As you go around the world, you'll find anvils that you have to lift out of the ground, or chests, and that's fine. They're just like pretty basic. But then there's parts where you have to lift platforms to get up to high areas, and it just felt like it was 20 seconds of lifting a platform for something. It just didn't feel like it added anything. It was just there as kind of like, oh look, we can raise this out of the sand. And then that was it. It's never really used. Maybe in the end game, like if you're doing all the open world objectives, there might be a couple of like cool applications of it, but for like just a normal run, like 10-15 hours where you do some side quests, you finish the main quest, the Gauntlet just doesn't really do much. It's not implemented well. Well, they're lifting out of the sand. The Gauntlet essentially activates everything in the game. Like it lifts chests out of the ground. It starts those puzzles or the time trials I was talking about. But the main thing was lifting crap out of the ground, lifting platforms, and I don't know. It just wasn't used well whatsoever. And then, of course, another massive element of this game is the combat system. And this is surprisingly good. It feels almost 100%. I'd say this combat system feels maybe 90% there in its sort of mechanics. It kind of feels maybe a bit janky, kind of a slight bit of AA jank to it. But behind the combat is this cool momentum system and a good way to build your character class, which I really like. So you have 3 different weapons to choose from. You have a gauntlet, an axe, and then this sword that kind of can also act as kind of like a grappling hook as well. And one thing I will say is I wish this game had more weapons, because by maybe 4 hours in, I had found all the 3 weapons, and you can equip any weapon as your main and any weapon as your secondary, so then you can mix and match them, which I do like. But I still would have liked to see a couple of more weapons, because as I said, after 4 hours, I'd already locked into what weapons I wanted to use, and I would have liked if there was something to kind of, you know, keep me coming back later on down the line where, oh, I found a new weapon, time to learn new combos, where I very quickly fell into, oh, these are my favorite combos. And even at that, there aren't too many different combos. I will say that the momentum system in this game carries it. Pardon the pun, obviously, because that's what momentum does. But it does sort of carry the combat system quite a bit. So to break it down, the momentum system is almost like, I would say, a combo meter. So the more proficient you are in combat, the higher your momentum meter goes up. And the higher your momentum meter goes up, all the perks that you equip are tier 1, 2, and 3. So as you move up your momentum system, or up your momentum bar, you'll start to unlock the perks that you have equipped, which is really nice because it rewards you for being good at the game. But how momentum works is there's tier 1, 2, and 3, and your weapons then have slightly different combos depending on what tier you're on. So the fists, for example, when I was using the fists, in tier 1, they were just like a pair of gauntlets that you'd punch people with. But as you go up the tiers, they kind of break off, and then you have like four gauntlets on each arm, or 3 gauntlets or something. So then you're actually like doing a load of hits, and the difference in your power is mad. Like if you really, because the enemies kind of feel a little bit spongy, especially the bosses, if even on easy, because in the review guide they said on normal difficulty certain bosses are too hard to beat. And I wouldn't say that they're like overly difficult, it's just that they're really spongy. And even on easy difficulty, a lot of the enemies feel spongy unless you kind of get good at using the momentum system to your advantage. Because the damage difference between a tier 1 and a tier 3 weapon is quite staggering. And then also you have this shatter ability, which is hold L2 and R2. And depending on what level your momentum system is at, you deal more damage with it, but it depletes your momentum. So it's almost like a little trade-off. Do I want to do a really powerful attack, or do I want to be able to keep up my sort of more powerful normal attacks and just dish out more damage over time rather than one big burst? And I really like this. This momentum system is great. I found it really fun. I found myself wanting to not get hit, because if you got hit, it would drain your momentum system. Especially if you go into the perks, because once you go into the perks, you can spec into, there's like purple, green, blue, and red one. So red, I think, was like mostly damage. Purple is kind of slowing down and status effects. Blue is momentum and shatter damage, and then green is like healing buffs. So you can kind of I built my character so that I was kind of built all around building up my momentum so that I always had a big momentum bar. And then when I did use my momentum bar, like for the big full attack, it dealt a lot of damage and it was really cool. And I could see that like in co-op, not that, you know, I wouldn't say it's like a build system. It is a build system, but at the end of the day, you'll still be doing like roughly the same combos. It's not going to change your playstyle completely. But it's like going to be cool that in co-op you could have somebody that does like specs into healing, so then his abilities then put down like a healing aura around them that your mates can get healed with. And I had one that put in a momentum aura that would like build a momentum bar of people. So yeah, it is pretty cool. That system is nice. The momentum system is really good, and that's my favorite part of the combat. And I already touched on the perks, but also you have abilities that you can equip for each tier. So again, just with the momentum system, if you have a tier 1, you can do your tier 1 ability. If you have tier 2, you can do your tier 2 ability, blah, blah, blah. And again, these just kind of add to the build crafting, I guess. And they're just a nice addition to give you something more to do during combat and something to build towards. And then, of course, you have armor, which you can upgrade. And different armor have different specs. So, you know, one might be more resilient, one might deal more damage, blah, blah, blah. But also, depending if you keep upgrading it, you then have these parameters that you have to meet. So say we'll say use 3 momentum perks and then you will get plus something, or use 3 offensive perks and you will get plus something. It's not like the deepest system in the world, but everything's kind of working towards building something in the background, where I think a game like Forspoken kind of felt a bit lackluster there. It felt like I didn't understand why Forspoken had like a sort of gear and RPG mechanics, because they didn't really change much. Whereas here, they kind of felt like I was actually building my character to be a certain type of like playstyle, which is just nice. In an open world game, it never has to be super deep, but it needs to be something that I can actually think about, you know, and not something that is just completely useless like in Forspoken. So I did really appreciate that in Atlas Fallen. Now, unfortunately, after 5 or 6 hours, the game kind of ran out of ideas. So this game took me about 10 hours to beat, and for the first area, I kind of did a lot of open world objectives, and I realized that they're kind of boring, bar those time trials. And I also did a lot of errands, which are just, you know, very like basic side quests. You know, talk to this guy. Oh, my friend is stuck in a mine. Help kill these enemies so he can come back and you get like some money or something, you know. And then there's also side quests, and the side quests, again, they might get better down the line, but from what I've done of the first 2 areas, they're nothing to write home about. As a checklist open world game, they're just another thing to add to the checklist. But I mean, I just couldn't care about them. And unfortunately, it's the same with the story. And it's because of 2 things. This world didn't really stand out to me. It's cool having a world that's like a sand-based world, because I mean, it doesn't happen too much in these sort of like fantasy RPGs, but I literally only finished the game, I don't know, 8 hours ago or something, and I'm struggling to sit here and remember anything interesting about the world. There's something about, I don't want to spoil too much, but there's something about two warring gods, and one god is kind of the evil, one god is the good, or so people picture it. And basically the Gauntlet speaks to you, and he's nowhere near as cheesy or annoying as the Gauntlet in Forspoken, but he's so bland, and his voice acting is seriously bad.
Not all is dead in this place. I feel relieved.
You remember this area?
Not fully, but it is familiar to me.
There's like a mixture of like quality in the voice acting. The main character I didn't like. The Gauntlet I didn't like. And then some of the like story characters had decent voices, but no voice ever really stood out. It's like they're all somewhere in the middle of kind of okay to kind of bad.
Ah, it's you. Any luck on keeping that thing safe to be around?
Yes. There shouldn't be any more problems.
All right. Please don't judge me if I don't take your word for it.
When it comes to the story, as I said, the world itself, there's not really much interesting there. Nothing really caught my eye. And then even the characters. I don't know. I don't remember any of the characters in this game. None of them, to me, had anything interesting to say. None of them had good voice acting. None of them stood out, like, design-wise. They all just looked like generic, just fantasy characters. And yeah, I for these open world games, it's not a big issue for me if I can't really get invested in the story. Like, I mean, we have Far Cry 3, which obviously kind of blew up the open world genre and showed that, yeah, it can have a good story and an interesting villain, but then ever since then, not many open world games have gripped me with story, and that isn't an issue for me. But it's the fact that the story and the world isn't interesting, but also there isn't really much variation, because after 6 hours of this game, the Gauntlet doesn't really get any different. You unlock an ability that lets you lift heavier items out of the sand and can crush locks on things, but it's all just to find more chests or to do one of these kind of menial open world objectives that I didn't really find interesting. And then, as I said, with the weapons, there's not much variation because you only have 3 weapons. I would have liked to see a couple more. And the enemy variety, I will give them. There is quite a few enemies, but eventually you figure out how to fight all of them. And they're not particularly difficult. They can be spongy at times. But I think that is like the takeaway from Atlas Fallen. It has a fun traversal system. It's not bloated, which I really appreciate. The combat has some really good ideas with that momentum system. It feels about 90% there. Now, the aerial combat, which I didn't really touch on, does feel nice because you can really keep yourself in the air, which I do like. But ultimately, it runs out of ideas after about 6 hours. Story never gripped me. Open world objectives didn't grip me. Again, I can appreciate it's not bloated. And it would be an easy platinum. Right now, I'm pretty sure this game is coming out. It's €50 on Steam. I played it on PC. Played it on my deck, on my PC, and my laptop. And it runs grand. On the deck, I could comfortably run it at 30 FPS, no problem. On my PC and my laptop, I was running at 60 FPS. And the game looks pretty good. It's more kind of the vistas. There are certain vistas where you're up in a high mountain and you're like, oh yeah, this game looks good. But then the smaller sort of, certain character models, certain textures, they don't really look good. But as a package, when you're moving fast, I think the game does look pretty good. It is a budget title. I personally wouldn't recommend this game at €50. I think this is wait for a slight sale. Like in 2 or 3 months when you might find it in like GameStop or Amazon for €35-40. Because it's fun. It has some fun ideas, but it's just a run-of-the-mill open world game. I enjoyed playing it, but the last 2 or 3, like maybe 2 hours that I played of it kind of didn't really... I was like, oh, well, I mean, I'll try beat it for a review, so I beat it. And then I was thinking, oh, well, I'll go back and maybe do some open world more, just kind of mop up some open world objectives, but I'm really not feeling it. There's not much bringing me back. So, yeah, that's Atlas Fallen. Thank you, Focus Entertainment, for sending me out the code. I appreciate that. And, yeah, let me know what you think of Atlas Fallen. I really appreciate your time. Join the Discord, follow Twitter, blah, blah, blah. Goodbye, and thank you very much for watching.